Hey guys, I recently redid my wrestling DVDs, so I was looking at a few of them. Just wanted to do a couple videos of some of my favorite wrestling DVDs that I own. And if you're like me, a wrestling fan, you always want to know about all behind the scenes information about what went on and all that information about how they set up matches and the whole thing. So one of the things I highly recommend is these shoot interviews made by kayfabe commentaries, and they have a series called Timeline. They have one for WWE and one from WCW. I think they have one for ECW too. So what they do is they take a particular year in the wrestling business, and they'll have an interview with someone that had a particular played a pivotal role during that year, either a wrestler or a booker or a manager, and they go through the year discussing the events that took place. So I have two here. I know a lot of people. There's some people that like Jim Cornette, and there's a lot of people that don't like Jim Cornette. I'm a Jim Cornette fan. I really enjoy his view on wrestling. You know, I'm an old school wrestling fan, so I like the wrestling from the '80s and the '90s. So I agree with a lot of things that he says. So I have here the timeline history of WCW from 1989 and one from 1990. Now, what's cool about this is if you do a search, they actually uploaded this one on YouTube, so you can actually watch it right now. You don't have to even pay for it. It is a 2-disc set, so I think right now they only uploaded the first disc, but it's really informative. So I highly recommend if you're really into, you know, that era of wrestling and you want to know a little bit more behind the scenes. I highly recommend that you definitely check this out. So the first thing, because Jim Cornette played a big role during that time period, because not only was he a manager managing the Midnight Express, he was also part of the booking committee. So he has all the stories, and when you watch it, he has a whole notebook of the notes of that era and all that. So he knows, the attendance, what every guy got paid, all that stuff is very informative. You look at the wrestling business, even this one. Hopefully, maybe they'll upload '89 too. I always look at this time period, and WCW is like an NWA. It was like wrestling was really hot. You talk about the boom eras of wrestling. Wrestling was really hot, like mid to late '80s. That was for me. I don't know anything about prior, in the '70s, '60s, or '50s. I'm not sure about that. But you always talk about the Monday Night Wars. But before that, the mid to late '80s, WrestleMania, WrestleMania 3. Look at the attendance records. WWE, they had the partnership with MTV. They were doing the Rock and Wrestling connection. Hulk Hogan was appearing on Saturday Night Live, MTV, all that stuff. Breaking grounds. Even for NWA, if you watch some of the old stuff, if you go on WWE Network and you watch, anything from '85, '86, you watch some of those shows, you see a sellout crowd, and they were doing really well business wise. They had a different, they were different from WWE. WWE was more, or WWF, it was more cartoonish. NWA was more the serious wrestling, and but what the problem was, '87, Jim Crockett Promotions, Jim Crockett, they were making a lot of bad business decisions that really affected the company. At the time, Bill Watts had Mid-South Wrestling, and he transformed it. He rebranded it, I think, in the mid-'80s to Universal Wrestling Federation, and they were going out of business. And Jim Crockett bought that company, and a lot of people said that he might have spent a little more money on the brand, because you got to understand, in Mid-South, a lot of those guys that were, that wrestled in Mid-South had moved on to WWE, like Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Junkyard Dog. They had moved on to WWE. So you basically had a watered down version of Bill Watts' territory. But they did get guys like Sting, and I think Rick Steiner may have came along with that, but yeah, I know Sting came from Bill Watts' territory. That's how NWA got Sting. So he paid overpriced on that, and then they were going into different territories, different arenas, and that were not NWA friendly places. They were going up north, and ticket wise, I guess tickets suffered. it came down to the point where they had to sell the company, and that's when Ted Turner came in because he always wanted wrestling on his network because of the ratings. He always said that the ratings and TBS had Andy Griffin and Atlanta Braves baseball and wrestling. So he bought so you're looking into like '89. That's the deal happened in '88. So you got '89 talking about it, but let's just talk about 1990 because this is the one that's on YouTube now. You can watch this one. 1990 is when WCW really became a turning point. And you look at wrestling in the '90s, the early '90s. This is when it kind of went down. Even with WWE too, they were trying with Ultimate Warrior, and that didn't work out. So with WCW, especially WCW, they were trying to phase out the NWA name at the time. Ric Flair was the booker, and he was not getting along with Jim Herd. Jim Herd was the I guess the executive producer at the time. Think of him as kind of like the Eric Bischoff role. And Jim Herd, no one liked Jim Herd, and the thing is that Jim Herd just didn't have the. I guess he had a different view of the wrestling business, and his main thing is that he really wanted to replace Ric Flair. Ric Flair was on top. He'd been like the main guy from since '83 with the company, and Jim Herd was kind of really wanted to replace him, and kind of push him aside. And the whole deal was that Ric Flair was going to drop the title to Sting. They had built this whole thing up for Sting to defeat Ric Flair at Wrestle War, which was their February pay-per-view. And the problem was that, Jim Cornette, they discussed this whole thing in this DVD, was the problem, at the Clash of the Champions about a couple weeks before the pay-per-view, Sting injures his knee. He's out for a couple of months. So that changes the whole plans. So what they had to do was Lex Luger at the time was a heel. So they had to quickly change him to babyface because at the time they didn't really have any babyfaces that could take that position. So so Lex Luger had a feud with Ric Flair, and I think Jim Herd kind of wanted to do the title change, but Ric Flair had promised the title to Sting and wanted to keep his word. So basically, you had these really bad finishes. You can actually watch the tape on the WWE Network. It was Wrestle War '90, and then they had a rematch. I think at Chi-Town Rumble or something like that. They had a rematch, whatever. So they had two pay-per-views that Luger fought Flair. Then they eventually did the match with Sting at Great American Bash, so July. So you would think it was about 5 months later, and Jim Cornette really talks about how I think he said that the fans were ready for the title change in February, but 5 months later it was kind of like the buzz on Sting and Ric Flair kind of ran its course, and the problem with WCW, they didn't have enough heels for Sting to wrestle against. That was the problem because they didn't have enough. When you have a babyface champion, you want to line them up with different heels that they can challenge, and kind of like when Shawn Michaels was the champion in '96 when he beat Bret Hart. He had a line of challengers like British Bulldog, Vader, Mankind, Psycho Sid. So he had a line of challengers. So Sting didn't really have that, and they came up with this whole Ole Anderson was the booker at the time because Ric Flair had decided to leave the booking because he didn't want to work with Jim Herd anymore. And Jim Cornette talks about how Ole Anderson came up with this whole idea for the Black Scorpion storyline. And he came up with a murder mystery without knowing who the killer is, and that's where they didn't know who the mystery was, and it turned out that they didn't know who the Black Scorpion was going to be, and it turned out that they had to resort to Ric Flair, and a Starrcade '90 it turned out to be Ric Flair, so that was kind of a really bad storyline, and that really affected Sting. I think that they had more challengers for him. I know they did Sid Vicious at Halloween Havoc, and then, but it's really fascinating just to look back at the wrestling business, back in 1990, WCW, and Jim Cornette really talked about at the end how Jim Herd and all these bad booking decisions really put WCW back and it took a while for them to catch up to WWE. It took them almost like 6 years, and it wasn't until like the NWO when WCW started to get steam again, started to catch up, and started becoming, a watchable product, you would say. And you also talk about a lot of like guys, leaving, NWA in 1990, like the Road Warriors, Legion of Doom would go on to WWE. Eventually Ric Flair would leave, and then so it was just a really bad bad timing for WCW. And but highly recommend. Again, you can check this out on YouTube. 1990. Just search timeline WCW 1990. I don't know how long it will be on YouTube. I know they said something they might they might take it down. Who knows? But just trying to. I guess they're trying to promote their on demand service, which is like $14 a month. But I guess they're giving you kind of like a free preview of it. So definitely check that out. And if you're really interested, I guess you could definitely buy this one, 1989. Jim Cornette goes through that entire year. So yeah, you should definitely check it out. I mean, I really like it. I found these really, really interesting. It was really, really nice to look back, and then now you have the WWE Network. So if you want to see a certain match or pay-per-view, you just go on there and take a look at it.